For almost all of human history, life was, well, to be blunt, it was stagnant. Economic growth as we know it, this constant, dynamic, world-changing thing, it just wasn't a reality. And then, all of a sudden, something broke. Something changed. Today, we're going to explore the completely accidental revolution that created our modern world. Let's get right into it. So, you've got to ask yourself, what was the deal? I mean, why for thousands and thousands of years did economies barely budge? Now, the answer isn't that people weren't smart or they didn't have good ideas. No, the answer is way more fundamental. It lies in the very structure of society itself, a structure that was incredibly good at just one thing, making sure nothing ever really changed. You see, for most of history, societies operated in what academics call the natural state. And it's a pretty straightforward arrangement, really. You have a small, powerful group of elites, and they control everything. They decide who gets to start a business, who gets a say in politics, and basically who gets any rights at all. And why'd they do this? Simple, to hold on to their power and make sure any wealth that was created flowed right into their own pocket. I love this analogy on the slide here. Think of it as a fly-trap economy. Any little bit of extra money, any surplus you might create, that's the fly, and zap, it gets snatched up by the ruling elite. Now put yourself in that position. If you know that any profit you make, any great new idea you have is just going to get taken away, what is your incentive to work harder, to innovate, to invest your own money? Yeah, there isn't one. And so for centuries, progress was completely stuck in that trap. But a few societies did escape. It wasn't on purpose. They kind of stumbled into a totally new way of organizing themselves. And in doing so, they unleashed human potential on a scale nobody had ever seen before. They built an entirely new social order. And this right here shows you the night and day difference. On the one hand, you've got the natural state. It's all about who you know. Access is for the privileged few, and organizations are fragile. They basically die when their powerful founder does. But then, look at the open access order. Here, the rules are impersonal. They apply to everyone. It doesn't matter who you are. Anyone can form an organization, the rule of law protects you, and those organizations can live on forever. That right there, that's the foundation of our modern world. So here's the billion-dollar question. How did this happen? How do you get from a stagnant flytrap to a dynamic, open society? Well, the most important thing to understand is that it was not designed. Nobody sat down with a blueprint. Instead, it was the messy, accidental, completely unplanned result of several massive forces all colliding over centuries. So let's look at the first ingredient. And paradoxically, it's violence. Yeah, really. The constant, brutal, existential warfare that defined early modern Europe actually forced a fundamental change in the way states had to operate. What happened was this incredibly powerful feedback loop got started. You can see it here. It begins with just intense military competition. To survive, kings and rulers desperately needed more resources. Money, supplies, you name it. But they quickly learned that just taking money by force would wreck the very economy they needed. So they were forced to cut a deal. They would grant rights and legal protections for people's money and property in exchange for predictable taxes. And guess what? This bargain made the economy grow, which funded bigger armies, which just intensified the competition all over again, and the cycle just kept going. This whole period, this military revolution, it was like a brutal sorting mechanism. Only the most organized and sophisticated states survived. They had to build bureaucracies, create complex tax systems, and eventually establish total control over violence within their borders. It was a messy, awful process, a kind of statist revolution born out of pure conflict, but it forged the powerful, centralized states that were an absolutely necessary first step for everything that came next. Okay, so these stronger states are now on the scene, and they set the stage perfectly for our second key ingredient, a political revolution. This is all about the shift away from a ruler's personal whims to the predictable, impersonal power of institutions, and there's no better place to watch this unfold than in 17th century England. I mean, England went through decades of absolute turmoil. The Civil War proved that the elites could and would literally fight the king for power. Then the Glorious Revolution in 1688 cemented a brand new reality. Parliament, not the monarch, was now in charge. This was a huge part of the so-called Mercantile Revolution, where this newfound political stability started to supercharge trade and commerce, leading directly to incredible financial innovations like the Bank of England just a few years later. This quote, right here, it gets to the very heart of the change. See, before this, lending money to the king was a huge gamble. He could just wake up one day and decide not to pay you back. Tough luck. But now, the debt was owed by Parliament, a permanent institution that was going to outlive any single king or queen. Suddenly, the commitment to repay was far, far more credible. And the result of this newfound credibility? It was insane. The government's ability to borrow money just exploded. We're talking about an 8-fold increase. In less than a decade, state debt went from just 5% of the entire national economy to a whopping 40%. This financial firepower gave Britain a massive advantage in its ongoing rivalry with France. So you've got to understand, this financial revolution was really an institutional one. It marks the precise moment where power moved from the hands of a single person, from their personal whims, and became embedded in durable, impersonal rules and organizations. And that kind of predictability, well, that's the absolute bedrock of a modern economy. All right, so you've got a stronger state, and it's bound by predictable, impersonal rules. This created the perfect safe container for our third and final ingredient to really flourish: a dynamic market economy. But, and this is a big but, this market didn't just appear because of a few big inventions, which is the story we usually tell ourselves. Yeah, we often think of the Industrial Revolution being sparked by a handful of brilliant scientists in a lab. But as this great quote from E.L. Jones points out, that view is kind of backwards. For a long time, it was practical tinkering and clever engineering that mattered way more than formal scientific theory. The famous scientific revolution, with guys like Galileo, it laid the intellectual groundwork, for sure, but its direct impact on industry actually came much, much later. So what was it then? What really powered this early economic engine? Well, it was a bunch of less glamorous but way more fundamental things. You had production moving out of the cities, away from the tight control of the old guilds. You had slow but steady improvements in roads and canals that started connecting the country. And for the first time, a huge variety of consumer goods, things like clocks and books, became available to way more people. It was the quiet, gradual growth of the market itself. And this slide just perfectly illustrates the huge change in the elite mindset. You could even call it a mercantilist revolution in pure thought. They stopped seeing the economy as a larder, like a pantry they could just raid whenever they needed some cash. Instead, they began to see it as a valuable asset, an engine of growth that, if they nurtured it, would benefit both the state and the merchants. This shift in thinking was absolutely monumental. Okay, let's pull all these threads together. Because the key takeaway here, the one thing to really remember, is that this monumental shift wasn't some grand plan. It was a messy, unpredictable, and largely accidental process that just happened to completely remake the world. So here they are, the 3 keys we've been talking about. First, you needed a strong state, one forged in the fires of war. Second, that state had to be governed by impersonal rules, not by personal whims. And third, the state needed to see the market not as something to raid, but as a partner in creating prosperity. This is really the bottom line. The prosperous, dynamic, innovative world that we all live in today is not the product of some brilliant blueprint. It's the unintended consequence, the byproduct of centuries of elites fighting for power, of states fighting for survival, and of regular people just pushing for a little more freedom and a little more predictability in their lives. And all of this leaves us with one final and pretty crucial question. This transition from the natural state to an open access order is what made everything we have today possible. But if this world of incredible growth was built largely by accident, could it be accidentally undone? Is all the progress we enjoy something we can really, truly take for granted?